Trump's tariffs didn't bring manufacturing home. They just moved the final screwdriver. A dark room, a smartphone propped on a tripod, a ring light. A man in his 30s is live on TikTok. He's recruiting. The factory behind him just opened 1,000 new positions. That factory builds MacBooks. He's in Bac Ninh. That's a city in northern Vietnam, about 30 miles from the Chinese border. 1 year ago, the President of the United States stood in the Rose Garden and promised to end all of this. Bring the factories home. Make it in America again. He stood next to giant placards listing tariff rates for more than 180 countries. He called the day Liberation Day. And the language was unambiguous. Manufacturing was coming back. A year has passed. And here's the strangest part of the story. Of every dollar in an iPad shipped from this factory to America, less than 8 cents was actually made in Vietnam. The rest came from somewhere else. From across that border, just a few hours' drive away. From the country those tariffs were designed to push out of America's supply chain. Why is this happening? And why is Washington's next move already pointing straight at Vietnam? Today, we're going to take that one number apart, layer by layer. We'll look at the factory, we'll look at the math, and we'll look at what's almost certainly coming next. The promise of Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025. President Trump called it Liberation Day. He declared a national emergency under federal trade law, and he rolled out a sweeping tariff regime against more than 180 countries. The promise that day was simple, 2 parts. First, fix the $760 billion trade deficit with Asia. That number, Asia specifically, was the focal point. Second, bring manufacturing and blue-collar jobs back to America. Reverse decades of offshoring, rebuild the industrial base. The promise was bold, the language was direct, and what followed was a full year of trying to make it real. By April 9th, the tariff on Chinese goods reached 125%. Add the existing 20% fentanyl-related duty, and the total hit 145%. Beijing retaliated. American tariffs on Chinese imports went up. Chinese tariffs on American imports went up. Markets shook. The average effective U.S. tariff rate climbed to 27%. The highest level in a century. But it didn't last. A 90-day truce came in May. Talks moved through the summer. Then on October 30th, after a Xi-Trump summit, the 2 countries agreed to a 1-year ceasefire. The fentanyl tariff dropped to 10%. The reciprocal tariff held at 10%. The decisive turning point came on February 20th, 2026. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down Trump's country-by-country reciprocal tariffs. Their legal basis, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was ruled an unconstitutional use of presidential authority. The legal foundation of Liberation Day collapsed in a single decision. The administration moved fast. The same day, it imposed a 10% universal tariff under a different statute, Section 122 of the Trade Act, valid for 150 days. Then on March 11th, the U.S. Trade Representative opened formal investigations under Section 301, covering 16 economies: China, the European Union, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, Mexico, Japan, India, and others. The administration was rebuilding the tariff machinery on new legal ground. Through all of it, the policy kept dancing. From 125 down to 30, from court ruling to legal workaround, from maximum pressure to truce and back. But Bac Ninh did not dance. It just kept hiring. Why didn't Bac Ninh flinch when the policy around it was changing every few months? The answer lives inside 3 numbers. Anatomy of the shell game. The first number, 7.8%. That factory in Bac Ninh has a name, Fukang Technology. It's a subsidiary of Foxconn, the Taiwanese electronics manufacturing giant. Foxconn has built more iPhones than any company on Earth. Think of Fukang as Foxconn's forward base in Vietnam, the world's largest electronics manufacturer, planting a flag near the Chinese border. In 2025, this single facility exported $8.6 billion worth of products, mostly MacBooks, iPads, and motherboards for both products and servers. That's more than double its export value the year before. In 1 year, the operation's output to America roughly tripled. But here's the catch. Over the same period, Fukang imported $7.9 billion worth of components. From China, from South Korea, from Taiwan. Do the math. Exports minus imported parts equals $700 million. That's 7.8% of total exports. That is the maximum value created inside Vietnam. We say maximum because some of those imported parts may have stayed in Vietnam for domestic use or been re-exported to other countries. The actual value-added figure for what shipped to America could be lower than 7.8%. It is almost certainly not higher. To put it plainly, for every dollar of Fukang product that lands in an American customer's hands, less than 8 cents was generated by the work done in Vietnam. The other 92 cents was already done before the parts crossed into Vietnam at all. Is this really industry-wide? If it were just one factory, this would be a curiosity, not a story. But the same pattern shows up about 60 miles outside Hanoi in Phu Tho province. BYD, the Chinese company famous for electric vehicles. Most American audiences know it as the EV giant that's been gaining ground on Tesla globally. What's less known is that BYD also assembles iPads for Apple. Their 2025 exports, $5.1 billion. Imports of components, $4.9 billion. Vietnamese value added, 4.5%. And 61% of those imported parts came from China. What BYD does in Vietnam is take Chinese-made parts, screw them together, and ship them to America. Vietnam's economic share of that flow? About 1/20. Two different companies, one Taiwanese-owned, one Chinese-owned. Same playbook, different province, same border. The pattern is industry-wide. The provincial numbers confirm it. According to Bac Ninh's own government data, smartphone production in the province jumped 39.4% year-over-year in 2024. Laptop production surged 130.3%, more than doubled in a single year. The view from the factory floor matches the data. A Bloomberg reporter spoke with Hathi Mai. She's 38. She works the assembly line at the Fukang plant, testing code on circuit boards. The job needs no high school diploma, no prior experience. The only hard part, she says, is standing for hours at a time. She often pulls overtime shifts. Last year, with overtime, her income roughly doubled. What she told the reporter was telling. In the old days, jumping from one factory to another could land you on a blacklist. In the old days, jumping from one factory to another could land you on a blacklist. Rehiring would be hard. Today, demand is so high that workers can switch jobs and collect a fresh signing bonus each time with no penalty. Last year alone, Foxconn ran 5 separate hiring rounds. The biggest bonus on offer at the most aggressive round, 15 million Vietnamese dong, roughly $570 US. The fact that the blacklist has disappeared tells you something important. The Bac Ninh labor market is so overheated that supply cannot keep up with demand. This is not one company expanding. This is an entire industry pouring across the border. And the people who recruit workers for these factories are some of the busiest people in the country. The second number, a 25-point tariff gap. Why is all of this happening? The math gives a clean answer. According to the U.S. Joint Economic Committee's February 2026 trade update, here are the weighted average effective tariff rates over the past 12 months. Chinese goods, 35.99%. Vietnamese goods, 10.06%. Mexican goods, 4.28%. Ship the same iPad directly from China, and roughly 36% of its price gets paid in tariffs. Ship that same iPad through Vietnam, and the tariff is about 10%. Same product, same brand, same customer in California opening the box. The only difference is which country the box was sealed in. That tariff gap is more than 25 percentage points. But here's the thing. The value Vietnam adds during assembly is only 4 to 8% of the export price. The numbers might look mismatched. Why would anyone go to the trouble of adding 4% of value just to dodge a 25% tariff? That is exactly the point. Add 4% of value, capture 25 percentage points of tariff savings. The net economic gain is enormous. That is the most cost-effective answer Chinese manufacturers found over the past year. Nobody is cheating anyone. The tariff schedule itself priced this outcome in. When you raise the tariff on China to 36% and leave the tariff on Vietnam at 10%, you are quite literally telling factories where to relocate the final assembly step. The market did exactly what the price signal asked it to do. Why tariffs can't stop this? The third number, 2.5%. Let's go even deeper, past the assembly plant, into the product itself. When an iPhone arrives at a port in California, how much of it is really Chinese? How much is American? How much comes from somewhere else entirely? In 2025, Professor Farrokh, contractor of Rutgers Business School, published a detailed breakdown. He took the most recent generation of iPhone and traced the value of every component back to where it was actually made. The FOB price of an iPhone 16, the price at the moment it leaves China for export, is about $563.73. Of that, the value actually created in China is $38.89. About 6.9%. Here's how that breaks down. Chinese-made components, roughly $4 in one category, plus another $21 in another. And then, separately, Foxconn's assembly work performed inside China, $14. Pause on that for a moment. On a product priced over $500 at the factory gate, the assembly itself costs just $14. That's 2.5% of the total cost. So where does the other 90% come from? The United States, Apple's research and design, software, the brand itself, the intellectual property and the engineering lab in Cupertino, California. South Korea, Samsung memory, SK Hynix memory, Samsung's OLED display. Japan, Sony image sensors, multiple precision components. Taiwan, the processor chip. Designed by Apple, but fabricated by TSMC in plants outside Taipei. Most of an iPhone's value was already created outside China before anyone even thought about moving final assembly to Vietnam. The phone is, in a real sense, a global product wearing a Chinese passport. So what does a tariff actually hit? The assembly, 2.5% of the cost. The only piece of the value chain that physically lives in China. And moving that 2.5% from China to Vietnam? It's not hard. You build a new building, you hire workers. You put the same machinery in. The components keep coming from the same suppliers. The product keeps going to the same customer. That is the structural reason for everything we've watched over the past 12 months. The tariff went after the smallest, most movable piece of the value chain. And the market moved that piece to where the tariff was lowest. Why Chinese firms do this best? There's another question worth asking. Why are Chinese manufacturers, specifically, the ones who pull this off fastest and most cheaply? Why isn't a Vietnamese or Indonesian firm capturing this opportunity instead? Dan Wang, China director at the Eurasia Group, put it this way to Bloomberg. His next sentence is the key. They have such large supply chains, from upstream to midstream to downstream, that it's easier to contain costs at each segment. His next sentence is the key. Why strategic? Look at a map. Why strategic? Look at a map. From Bac Ninh, the Chinese border is 2 hours by car. Components made in factories across Guangxi province in southern China can reach a Bac Ninh assembly line in half a day. Haiphong, Vietnam's main export port for the U.S. market, sits just 40 miles away. The geography drives the cost of dodging tariffs almost to zero. Truck the parts down, assemble, truck the finished products to port. Ship to Long Beach. Other countries don't have this combination. Indonesia is a long boat ride from China. India has political tensions with Beijing. Mexico is too far from the Chinese supply base. Vietnam is the unique address where everything lines up. This did not start yesterday. And the address change did not begin in 2025. According to an analysis from Wells Fargo Supply Chain Finance, the share of U.S. corporate supply chains coming from Northern Asia, meaning China, Hong Kong, and Korea, has dropped from 90% to 50% over the past decade. When was that shift fastest? 2018 to 2020, right after Trump's first trade war began. The pace of moving away from Northern Asia nearly doubled in those 2 years. Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at the Heinrich Foundation, summed it up. In other words, the tariffs of Trump 2.0 did not create a new trend. But market uncertainty sped up supply chain relocation out of China. In other words, the tariffs of Trump 2.0 did not create a new trend. They accelerated a trend that was already 7 years old. The shell game has been running since the first trade war. The current administration just made it run faster. The money didn't disappear, the address just changed. You can see that acceleration plainly in the trade data. Bloomberg's analysis found that U.S. imports from China fell by $51 billion in 2025. Over the same period, imports from Vietnam, India, Mexico, and a few other countries rose by $49 billion. That's nearly a perfect offset. About 96% of the supposed reduction from China simply showed up coming from somewhere else. Total imports of the 7 biggest electronics categories came to $130 billion, down only 1% from 2024. The number of computers, phones, and gaming consoles entering America barely changed at all. The money didn't shrink, the address just changed. And there's one more piece of evidence. RBC Economics published a detailed analysis in April 2026, looking at 1 full year of the new tariff regime. Their conclusion was direct. Read that carefully. In fact, the U.S. manufacturing sector is continuing to lose jobs. Read that carefully. After a year of the most aggressive tariff regime in a century, after a 145% peak rate on Chinese goods, after a Liberation Day declaration of national emergency, the U.S. manufacturing sector is still shedding jobs. The factories left China. They did not come home to America. They went to a city 30 miles across the Chinese border. A new Maquiladora flipped inside out. 1965 on the other side of a border. What's happening in Bac Ninh is not historically new. We've seen something very much like this before. In fact, the United States itself helped invent the model. In 1965, the Mexican government launched something called the Border Industrialization Program. The idea was to build factories along the U.S. border. Thousands of them eventually. We know them as maquiladoras. The pattern was straightforward. American components crossed the border into Mexico. Low-wage Mexican workers assembled them. The finished products crossed back into the United States, exempt from most tariffs. When NAFTA formalized this system in 1994, more than 5,000 maquiladoras were employing millions of workers along that border. Cars, electronics, textiles, appliances. American consumer goods, assembled cheaply in Mexico, sold throughout the United States. For 60 years, this was the dominant model of cross-border manufacturing in North America. And for most of that time, U.S. policy supported it. Bac Ninh, a 21st century maquiladora. On the surface, Bac Ninh looks like a 21st century version of the same thing. A border location, low-skill assembly, finished goods shipped to the consuming market. The architecture is recognizable. But there are 3 crucial differences. And those differences explain why, this time, America wants to stop the pattern instead of building it. Difference 1. The parts flow has reversed. In the maquiladora model, the components came from the United States. American firms made the parts. Mexican workers assembled them. Finished products returned home. The American economy gained value in 2 directions. From parts manufacturing exports going south, and from product margins coming back north. The factory might have been in Mexico, but most of the dollars stayed in the U.S. economy. In the Bac Ninh model, the components come from China. Chinese factories make the parts. Vietnamese workers assemble them. Finished products go to America. But there are no American parts in the box. Almost no new value is added to the American economy. Instead, the dollars American consumers pay flow back through Vietnam into Chinese supplier factories. China's manufacturing capacity is preserved. The architecture looks similar. The economic meaning is reversed. Same building, different beneficiary. Difference 2. The supply chain comes from a rival, not the consumer. This is the most fundamental difference of the 3. In the 1965 maquiladora, the parts came from the consuming country itself. America provided them. America consumed the products. Value that crossed the border came back across the border. The whole loop was an American policy design, deliberately engineered to serve American interests. It was, in effect, a way for American companies to reduce their own costs while still supplying American consumers. In Bac Ninh, the parts come from a strategic rival. China provides them. America consumes the finished goods. Dollars that flow across that Vietnamese border do not come home. They strengthen Chinese manufacturing capacity, the exact thing the tariffs were supposed to weaken. Vietnam itself sits in a unique geopolitical position. It shares an 800-mile border with China. China is its largest trade partner and the dominant supplier of components to its industrial base. At the same time, the United States is its largest export market. Vietnam will not pick a side, it cannot. It plays the role of strategic balancer between the two superpowers. That is its geopolitical posture, and it is not going to change. Difference 3. This time, America wants to stop it. So the response from Washington is fundamentally different. The Maquiladora was part of American policy. The U.S. government designed it, supported it for decades, and embedded it in NAFTA. American consumers benefited from cheaper goods. American companies benefited from lower production costs. American policymakers, broadly, were happy with the arrangement. Bac Ninh is a side effect of American policy. The U.S. government did not intend it. It is the unintended consequence of tariffs that were supposed to bring factories home, but instead pushed them across a different border. American policymakers are not happy with the arrangement at all. In July 2025, the United States agreed to a framework deal with Vietnam. One of the key terms was a 40% tariff on transshipment. The intent was clear: stop China from using Vietnam as a backdoor to the U.S. market. The deal was, in effect, an admission that Vietnam had become exactly what the tariffs were not supposed to create. But here's the paradox. According to analysis from the Lowy Institute in Australia, the 20% baseline tariff on Vietnam compared to the 50+% rate on China has effectively restored the tariff advantage Vietnam enjoyed after Trump's first trade war. By lowering Vietnam's rate to 20% while keeping China's much higher, Washington essentially recreated the very gap that drove factories from China to Vietnam in the first place. One hand is trying to block the transshipment. The other hand is keeping a tariff structure that encourages it. As long as that contradiction holds, the assembly lines in Bac Ninh keep growing. Vietnam is next. A new landscape, Vietnam now bigger than China. Why is Washington watching Vietnam right now? One number tells the whole story. According to the U.S. Joint Economic Committee's February 2026 trade data, here are America's 3 largest goods trade deficits over the past 12 months. Number 1, Mexico, $194.6 billion. Number 2, Vietnam, $187.9 billion. Number 3, China, $172.9 billion. Notice something? Vietnam has already passed China by more than $15 billion. A year ago, no one in Washington thought of Vietnam as a major trade deficit problem. Vietnam was a friendly trade partner, a useful counterweight to China, a small player in the broader picture. Today, Vietnam is a bigger source of the U.S. trade deficit than China itself. And the gap is growing every month. The optics of that shift in Washington political terms are very difficult to ignore. Jianxin Heng, senior Asia analyst at BMI, summed up Vietnam's predicament this way. The market's logic and the political logic, he argues, are now pointing in the same direction. The market's logic and the political logic, he argues, are now pointing in the same direction. Vietnam is exposed. Washington's response package. The administration has already started reacting. There are 3 moving pieces. First, the July 2025 framework deal with Vietnam. A 20% baseline tariff on Vietnamese exports to the U.S., plus a 40% transshipment tariff designed specifically to catch Chinese goods rerouted through Vietnamese factories. The implementation date for this deal is still officially undefined, but the framework is on the table. Second, the February 20th Supreme Court ruling against the country-specific reciprocal tariffs. That decision shattered the legal foundation of Liberation Day. But the administration had already pivoted. It moved to Section 122 of the Trade Act for the universal 10% tariff. And it pivoted to Section 301 for the next round of country-specific pressure. Third, the Section 301 investigations the U.S. Trade Representative opened on March 11th. 16 economies in scope: China, the European Union, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, India, and others. The official charge is structural overcapacity in manufacturing sectors. The real target, most analysts agree, is countries that have been functioning as detour routes for Chinese industrial subsidies and Chinese export volumes. Then there's the political language coming out of the White House. Peter Navarro, a senior trade advisor to Trump, has publicly claimed that 1/3 of Vietnamese exports to the United States are simply relabeled Chinese goods. The claim has been disputed by trade economists, who argue most Vietnamese exports do involve genuine local value added. But here's the irony. Bloomberg's own factory-level analysis found Vietnamese value added at certain plants of just 4 to 8%. The reality could be that more than half of certain Vietnamese export categories are essentially Chinese products with a final assembly stamp. The reality could be that more than half of certain Vietnamese export categories are essentially Chinese products with a final assembly stamp. The real problem is that the legal definition of transshipment is still undefined. Is 4.5% of value added enough to count as Vietnamese? Or do you need at least 30%? The answer to that question will determine the fate of tens of billions of dollars in trade flows. And that answer has not yet been written down anywhere. A hidden second effect. There's a dimension that most analysts overlook. What happens economically if Washington actually does crack down on transshipment? Robin Brooks, the former chief economist at the Institute of International Finance, made a sharp observation right after the Vietnam Framework Deal was announced. Read that carefully. Part of the answer is that Chinese transshipments through third countries softened the inflationary impulse. As the U.S. cracks down, that impulse will grow. Read that carefully. Brooks is arguing that the very leakage Washington is now trying to seal has been quietly absorbing the inflation that the tariffs were supposed to create. The tariffs went up. But because the Chinese goods kept flowing in, just relabeled as Vietnamese, American consumer prices didn't rise as much as the tariff math implied they should. The shell game has been a hidden inflation suppressant. Stop the shell game and you remove the suppressant. That is the dilemma Washington is now quietly facing. Allow transshipment and Vietnam becomes a permanent Chinese backdoor. Stop transshipment and U.S. consumer prices face new upward pressure right when the political appetite for inflation is at zero. There is no choice without a cost. Two scenarios. Let's look at the next 12 to 18 months. We'll lay out two main paths. Scenario 1, status quo, the most likely path. The legal definition of transshipment remains vague. Enforcement resources stay limited. Even when the Section 301 investigations conclude, actual sanctions move slowly. Bac Ninh's assembly lines keep expanding. Vietnam's trade surplus with the U.S. keeps growing month over month. Why is this most likely? Because Washington isn't ready to absorb the inflation that real enforcement would unleash. The political cost of higher consumer prices, especially in an election cycle, exceeds the political benefit of closing the loophole. Inertia wins. Scenario 2, hard enforcement. Transshipment gets a strict legal definition. The 40% tariff actually starts getting collected at U.S. ports. Three things follow. The Vietnamese dong faces currency pressure as the export pipeline narrows. Foxconn, BYD, and other major manufacturers freeze their Vietnamese capital expenditure. Construction projects in Bac Ninh and surrounding provinces pause. The recruitment booms cool overnight. Multinationals diversify simultaneously into India, Malaysia, Mexico, Thailand. Multinationals diversify simultaneously into India, Malaysia, Mexico, Thailand. The supply chain becomes harder to track and harder to tariff. At the same time, U.S. consumer prices face new upward pressure. The hidden subsidy from cheap relabeled Chinese goods disappears. Inflation reads higher. The Federal Reserve faces a harder choice. There is, in theory, a third path. Vietnam could be formally pulled into the American supply chain framework with strict rules of origin and caps on Chinese component content. But given how integrated Vietnam and China already are, this looks unlikely in the short term. It would require Vietnam to walk away from its largest supplier, which is also its closest neighbor. 4 variables worth watching. If you want to track where this story actually goes, watch 4 things. First, the first hearing in the U.S. Trade Representative's Section 301 investigation. That's where you'll learn whether this becomes real economic pressure or just a negotiating chip in a broader deal. Second, the implementing regulation for the U.S.-Vietnam transshipment definition. It hasn't been published. When it is, that document will largely decide Bac Ninh's future. Third, the ratio of Vietnam's monthly imports from China to its monthly exports to the United States. As long as that ratio stays close to 1, the Bac Ninh model is still working as designed. When it starts dropping meaningfully, something fundamental has changed. Fourth, announcements of new factory investment from Foxconn, BYD, and the other major contract manufacturers. Not just the dollar amounts, watch the geographic spread. If you see simultaneous expansion announcements into India, Malaysia, and Mexico, that's a signal we're moving into scenario 2. A note on investment. One frame to leave you with. Multinational companies with heavy Vietnam exposure and Vietnam-related assets in general have been treated by the market as winners of the trade war. The narrative has been straightforward. China loses, Vietnam wins. Buy Vietnam. But now that Vietnam has become one of America's largest sources of trade deficit, the policy risk premium on that thesis is due for repricing. The sweetest moment of any trade is often the most dangerous one. The entire investment case for Vietnam was built on the assumption that Washington wouldn't notice. Washington has now noticed. The man in Bac Ninh is still on TikTok. The recruiters with their tripods and ring lights are still standing outside factory gates every morning. Workers are still walking through those gates in waves. Buses are still arriving from villages out in the countryside, full of new hires looking for their first factory job. A Bloomberg reporter caught up with another voice on the ground. Nguyen An, a recruiter working on commission. His words were simple and they captured the moment exactly. This was not the picture the Rose Garden speech promised in April 2025. We're going to be busy all year. This was not the picture the Rose Garden speech promised in April 2025. Manufacturing returning to America, blue-collar jobs coming back. The reshoring of the industrial base. That promise has not been kept, not in the first year, not yet. And we now understand, structurally, why it hasn't. A tariff hits the smallest piece of the value chain. The assembly, just 2.5% of the cost of an iPhone. And moving 2.5% from China to Vietnam is not difficult. You build a building. You hire workers, you import the same parts, you ship to the same customer. The other 97.5% has been spread across a global value chain for 30 years. American R&D, Korean memory, Japanese sensors, Taiwanese chips. Bringing that back to America is not a matter of building a wall. It's a matter of dismantling 30 years of infrastructure and rebuilding it on different ground. If it can be done at all, it would take years. Maybe decades, certainly not 1 year. So here's the takeaway. Deglobalization through tariffs has not produced reshoring. It has produced regionalization. America did not reduce its dependence on China. It just changed the address of the dependence. The dollars still flow east across the Pacific. They just take a slightly longer route now, with one extra stop in Vietnam. The iPads are still imported. The MacBooks are still imported. The phones, the laptops, the gaming consoles, all still imported. Only the label on the back of the box has changed. Same product, same supply chain, different stamp. Same product, same supply chain, different stamp. America wanted to build a tariff wall around China. The wall got built. But walls have a way of creating new routes. And the new route runs through Bac Ninh.